All right. Hello, everyone. I think it's 12:05 now, so I think we're going to get started with the event. Thank you so much for joining. So this is the very first event of the Future Flavours of Sound Festival 2022, made possible by the funding from the University of Edinburgh Student Experience Grant. So a big thank you to them for making this possible. I'm Jack, one of the festival organisers, and I'm going to be here just to introduce the event to everyone and get us started. This event is focusing on audio programming and sound technologies. So it's probably all the events are quite varied, but this is, it's a big, broad topic, but it's looking at the intersection of technology and creative design and sound. So it should be very exciting. And we've got two lovely panelists with us here to discuss the work, Jake Sachs Michelani and Jan Cesnik. And if we could just get them up on the call with me here, I'm going to invite them both to introduce themselves to both of you. Jan, would you like to start?
Yeah, sure. Hello, I'm Jan. So I live in Stockholm now. I lived for a long time in Edinburgh, where I did my master's, the same master's I suppose a lot of you were doing. In amazingly 2006 to 2007, which seems like a very long time ago now. So now I'm doing a PhD at KTH University in Stockholm on interactive sound and sustainability. Generally speaking, my focus has been kind of interface design for performance and sort of experimental sound art things, as well as I ran a game studio for a little while, and just general kind of interactive noise, I guess, interactive sound stuff, generally with a slightly playful or very playful twist. So yeah, that's me. Hello. Great to see you all.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And now, Jake, would you like to say a few words?
Sure. I'm Jacob Sachs Michelani. You all can call me Jake. I'm calling in from Brooklyn, New York. Currently, my background is in classical composition. So my undergrad degree from SUNY Purchase is in composition, and a lot of my work has been on chamber music with electronics. But over the past couple of years, a lot more of what I've been working on is purely electronic music, and specifically building sequencers and generative music machines with Max MSP. I'm currently working on a PhD in composition at the CUNY Graduate Center here in New York. My research focus is on the music of Pierre Schaeffer. So honestly, a lot of the Max MSP stuff that I do is like sort of the side project that took over my life. But I teach music technology at Brooklyn College and Hunter College. And I think that's a lot of what I'm doing.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. So happy to have you both here with us. Just to let everyone know in the call, this will be recorded to be hosted on our website after the fact. So just be aware of that. And also, we should have some time at the end of this event for a general Q&A with our panelists about the work as well. So if you have any questions along the way, feel free to pop them in the chat. And we've got our fellow organizer, Harleen, here, who'll keep track of those, and we'll be able to bring the questions up at the end. So the way this event is going to run is we have 4 different submissions of work that are going to be discussed by the creators and by the panelists. So we're going to show you, we're going to introduce each work, then show a 2 to 3 minute clip showing the work so that everyone has a vague idea of what's going on in the pieces. Then we'll bring the creators of the work into the call with the panelists, and we'll have a 15 to 20 minute discussion on the work. So great. I think we're ready to get started. So let's cue up the first piece of work. So this piece is called Solar System by Chen. And this is a VST3 plugin, which was designed to create drone music made with the Juice framework. So we'll play the video for that just now. Excellent. So now we're going to welcome the creator, Chen, to the call. We should be able to get him up on the spotlight, and excellent. Great. Welcome, Chen.
Hi.
I figured it might be nice to start with if the panelists want to talk about their impressions of the work, and then obviously I'll sit back and let you have a discussion. So, Jake, if you'd like to start, and I'll.
Sure. Chen, beautiful plugin. It sounds amazing. I hope to play with it soon. Really happy to see you using Reaper also. Got to have a little Reaper shout out. Yeah, it's an awesome. I love the sound of it. I'm really curious to hear a little bit about what's happening under the hood, because
Yeah, me too.
It's a little difficult to tell. Not that that's a bad thing. And I'm kind of interested in having a conversation about the user interface. I feel like there's you have like so many controls, which is kind of a cool thing. And I feel like that gives a lot of options for different ways of organizing things and maybe grouping controls. But I'm curious to know your thoughts on that. And then I have a few possible ideas.
Yeah, I know it's quite confusing. In like the value name, it's hard to relate to the sound aspect, like the mass of sound or something like that. So what I did is I was like thinking about what if we can hear that something we don't hear, like in the universe, every stars and each planet, they're all doing the circular motion. Only the frequency is very low, so they're actually making sound, like very very low bass sound. So I was like thinking, what if we can hear the bass sound? So what I did is to simply rebuild a system like the solar system. So there are stars and planets, and I adjusted the scale to make the sound audible. So so the system is not quite. I didn't do it realistically, but aesthetically, so the main purpose to create the timbre. So I just borrowed the model of the universe, mm-hmm. and make the sound, sound nice. So, for example, the mass of the sun, it affects the gravity to the planet. So it actually changed the amplitude and the period, the frequency of the planet's oscillators. And the controls is quite similar. So the name of them is physically, but because it's only designed for me to use, so I didn't care what was the name of the values. So I think that's the idea of this plugin.
Cool. So you're planning on being the only person to use it? Are you thinking of it like the plugin is like a piece that only you play, or would you consider like releasing this publicly at some point?
Yes. Yes. I think it's hard for others to get on with it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Cool.
I have a lot of thoughts.
I designed the plugin for my drum music making.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Sorry,
why
go ahead,
don't
Jack.
you
If
go
you
ahead?
had, I didn't mean to interrupt you. I wasn't sure.
No,
if
no,
you had more
I
things.
wanted to. You go ahead, please.
So yeah, it's interesting to hear a description of it from you, because I think Jack and I had probably the same situation where we all we saw was the name solar system. You're right, and then the sound being made, and then the names of all of these parameters, and then I was kind of like putting that all together and thinking like, okay, I guess this is sort of a model of the complex system of the solar of a very complex system, and then attaching sound to the changes in values, I guess, or just the frequencies. But yeah, and that's, I mean, I loved it right away. I thought that was awesome, super interesting. So I'm glad to hear that my assumption was more or less correct. But it's also really interesting to hear it from your perspective, because then it's interesting how you frame it as like, I had to make it sound good. I had to change. I had to change I went for you. You said you went for aesthetic instead of realism, or however you put it. And of course you did. And I think in a way, I kind of just want to tell you, like, don't worry about that. Like, that's okay. Like, you have to, obviously, like, if you just listen only to the straight, multiplied by 300 version of the frequency of an orbit, like, yeah, it's not going to sound very interesting. And, the word, if what you're doing is sonification, right? You're sonifying the data, and there's a whole kind of world of people doing studies about and applying this type of approach to things. But in my opinion, a lot of it is really boring. Like, a lot of it is not that interesting, because people get kind of a little bit too stuck, in my opinion, on the accuracy and the need for kind of like for the use case of it. Whereas I love that you're using this as a starting point for a tool to make really nice sound. I mean, the sound itself is great, like super textured and all these really cool things. And then the extra bit that I think makes it super interesting for me is that everything is changeable. Like, that it's like, yeah, great. What happens if you change the mass of Neptune or whatever? Like, that's awesome. Like, that is what's really cool. And I'd say, like, that's good. That's all great. Like, there's no need to apologize for it. There's no need to say like, oh, hey, this isn't accurate. Like, no, who cares? Like, you are modeling a complex system that is, a complex system of orbits and gravity and all that, and how mass changes that and everything. And I think that's really, really, really cool. And then, so I just like, I had a similar kind of set of questions to Jake, of kind of like, okay, so then, like, where, like, this is great. This is really nice. So now, like, where can it go? So I don't know, Jake, you can take back over if you want. I just said a lot, but if I have other thoughts, but I can get back to them as well.
No, I totally agree with you. I love the sort of like poetic interpretation of the universe, and that seems like kind of the right middle ground for a sonification type piece. It's like, it's your personality, and it's also like this thing in the world that you want to interpret. Yeah, but Chen, I have some ideas, some user interface ideas. I guess maybe I don't know. Maybe I'll just throw a couple ideas out there. I'd be curious to know what you think of them. So one thing I noticed you doing was, like, so you have this massive list of parameters, and you're going through and changing them one at a time. And in terms of the sound that was coming out, I found it really satisfying. It felt like it was kind of moving at the right pace, but I thought it might be nice for you to be able to control multiple parameters at once in a way that's kind of interlocked. So a couple different ways of doing that would be, first of all, having multiple parameters controllable in like a 2D or 3D space, like an XY pad or or one with a third dimension, so that you could have like just, you could do like a gesture that swoops around and it will change a couple of different things. And there's a lot of plugins that do that. But just to point you in a direction of someone specifically who does it, there's a great artist, Suzuki Kentaro, who makes Max for Live devices. And many of his are based on this like sort of 3-dimensional space as the user interface, and they look really beautiful. And it ends up, his devices are like really complex like yours with so many different parameters, but the actual user end of it is not complex and it's very gestural. So that was one idea. And the other idea, and then I'll let you talk because I'm curious to know what you think about it. The other idea would be to have big groups of parameters, like for example, the mass of every planet in the universe is grouped together and you have one knob for the mass. But then you could have a second knob which sort of like spreads the masses. So you would have like, you turn knob 1 and they all go up, but then you turn knob 2 and they sort of spread apart. So by using just 2 knobs, you can get these sort of complex gestures, moving them around without having to individually turn all the knobs at the same time. Yeah, so those were my 2 control ideas.
Yeah, great ideas. I think the mass of the star is now doing what you said is spread, because when you increase the value, it will drag the closest planet to it and push the out the planets. So the planets, the frequency of them, they're going spreading. But yes, so I guess I can add another attribute.
Cool.
Make it change another way. Okay.
So a question: if you sort of like turned this on and then walked away, it moves by itself, right?
Yeah. Yes. The planets are like the carrier oscillators, and the stars are the modulators.
Okay.
Very cool.
So they're moving together, so they can automatically.
That's beautiful. I love that.
Yeah, it was interesting because I definitely, one of my thoughts was, I was like, the video is great. I also just wanted to just hear it just sit on its own for like 10 minutes and just be like, okay, because surely as I can imagine that it doesn't repeat much, if at all. Like it must kind of be being a fairly complex system. It must, and I loved that. Like I know that it's interesting. Like, so my thinking on the interface design is that there's when you have a lot of, it's like the modular synthesis situation, right? Like, which I see sometimes as a problem, right? The modular synthesis problem is if you have 1,000 knobs in front of you, you spend all the time doing this, like tick, 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 change. If you have 30 sliders on the screen, every human in the world will just go and start changing all the sliders. Like it is a fun, it's like, there's something about being, I guess, a sound person maybe, but also just generally human, that you just start playing around with these things. And it takes a lot of discipline. And there are very few synthesis people who have that discipline of just like sitting with a certain set. And, there's that in a way is interface led, which is something I think bring up a few times in all this stuff, is that it's like, you make this interface, you're going to play with it. Right. So like, that's cool. That's great. That's fine. But like, I think it's worth being aware of it too. And like, I can completely imagine a different version of this where you have almost none of those parameters. maybe you have one parameter to change and that's it, or two. Like how would that change how you use it? And I think that's like an interesting question and a challenge, because when you're designing this stuff from the ground up and you're making every single oscillator, the instinct is to put a slider on every single oscillator, right? Because that's what you're doing. You're aware that you can change these values. As the programmer, you know that value is changeable, and when you change it, it'll sound cool. That makes sense. So you put a slider on it, right? But there's the next level of interface design, which is like, well, does it need a slider? Does that have to have a slider? And maybe it does. And this isn't even a critique. It's just like it's another path to take. And related to that, for me, somebody just put in the chat. So paired with a visual as an installation work is quite similar to what I was going to say. What I was desperate to see was like an image of these planets moving, like what is that? I don't know if this would be possible at all, but if you wanted to put this out into the world, I could completely imagine you just like have, maybe a few controls. I don't know. Sure. Yeah. You have controls, but like you tie the sounds and to visuals of a sun getting bigger when you make the mass bigger. And then how does that change all the things around it? And, as sound people, we don't really always need that because we hear the difference. But for other people, I can completely imagine this being like just this like ambient sound generator, active kind of interactive tool thing, because people would love that. People would like, I maybe just because it's space, but I randomly thought of Kerbal Space Program. Has anybody ever played that game? It's this completely absurd game. It's totally ridiculous. And it's a universe thing, but Kerbal Space Program is basically, you have to you're given these little aliens and you have to build from nothing. You have to get them like to the moon. So like they have to learn how to do every single tiny little thing in order to build the spaceship. And so it's basically like you build a spaceship and the first one you build just like crashes because like you don't know what you're doing. And then you put two motors on and then they crash and they explode in a different way. So like, but what I mean is like, I think the thing that made me think of from your software of this game is like these tiny little controls that change a complex system, and then seeing and hearing that is just like a really fascinating thing. Like it's super fascinating. And also you've made it sound really good. So like, I think that all kind of works for me. Yeah. And then the last part, I think, just checking my notes. Yeah. The only other totally just to completely contradict what I said a second ago. Like I can also completely see this as a modular tool. You have outputs for each planet or something, and then you hook it up to, it could be a software modular thing as well. You could, this, instead of outputting sound, it could output control data. And then you map that control data to some other synth or a sampler or something. And then you end up with a modular sonification tool that you can actually adjust. And it's cool. There are certainly people I would imagine who would be interested in that. But again, it's kind of a different thing. Yeah, anyway, ideas. There we go. I've thrown a lot of ideas. I don't know if that's helpful, but I think it's a good sign that you show somebody this and it generates these kinds of thoughts. So yeah, those were my thoughts on it.
Just to interrupt for a moment, we've got a few minutes before we'll need to move on to the next work. So if you all have any final thoughts on this piece before we move on.
It's great. Yeah. Like Jan said, it's like very idea rich. I think that's a really great way to sum it up. There's like, it seems like it could go in so many different directions. I feel like I could listen to it for an hour or longer. I could imagine you doing a lot of performances with this, or making like 10-hour YouTube streams of just letting it sit or something. That it seems like there's, it's alive, it does really good stuff. So I could see you taking this in a lot of different directions.
Yeah, definitely. Don't underestimate how interested other people would be to play with this, because I think you could it's exciting for you, or it's rewarding for you, and you understand it. But I think you could probably, there's more to be done, I think. And well done. It's really cool.
Wonderful. I think we can. I think that's a nice moment to tie up that first piece. Thank you so much, Chen, for submitting that and sharing that. Absolutely, really cool to see it, and really cool to hear everyone's thoughts on it. So now moving to the second piece for this event. This is an audiovisual composition with Max by Yulin. And so we'll jump straight into the video demonstration of this work. Wonderful. So that was audiovisual composition with Max by Yulin. Now, very sadly, Yulin is unable to join us today. So unfortunately, we won't be able to have the same conversation format where we get Yulin up here to discuss the work. But we'll bring the panelists back now, and we'll still be able to hear the impressions on the work. And it's nice seeing everyone active in the chat as well. It's really cool hearing everyone else's impressions on the work. Yes, I'll hand it back over to you two.
Yeah, it's definitely too bad not to have somebody to the creator. There's a giant sub patcher at the bottom of that Max patch. I'm like, what is happening in there? I mean, I'll go first if you want. I don't mind talking through this a bit. My initial feeling on this was like, I found it to be a really a really good illustration of the kind of the tension between I don't know. I have this kind of inner theory I haven't explained that much to other people, so I apologize if I really stumble when I try to say it. But there's basically I'm constantly feel like I'm struggling with this the balance between directness and indirectness when it comes to interface design in all forms, I think, when it comes to sound, but in particular gestural interface, which I think we'll talk about a bunch more today as well. Like, if I move my hand, like, and I map that to sound in some way, like if I map it very directly, then I get all these benefits, right? I get all these benefits of like, it's immediate and I know exactly what's happening, and people who watch me know exactly what's happening, and the sound is very obvious and clear, right? But it also will probably sound like garbage, right? So it's like, okay, so then you start going down this path of kind of like, okay, well, I'll put a bit of delay on, and that'll make it sound a bit better. Or I'll use the slide object, and I'll make it like just a bit smoother, and then I'll do this and I'll do that and do that, and then you'd go down that road for a few hours, and then you do the movement again, and then people watching have no idea that your movement's controlling the sound. Right. So it's become very indirect. The mapping between my gesture and the sound is like, now it's there for me because I know what's happened, and I know what I'm doing in the process, but people watching can't see it anymore. And I think this is a really good illustration of that, where like the sound quality is like great. There's delays and reverbs, and it's all tuned and it's all very nice. But at the same time, I'm watching and I'm like, it's quite hard for me to see what that kind of like, what the gesture, how the gesture is controlling, and how it could be different. It could this change? Could this be a different system if the user gestured differently? It's quite hard. And so I think in a way I would suggest it's like, it kind of needs to be then like pulled back from that a bit more and made grittier. Like I kind of want to see the, like, let's go back to that core input data. Like, what's it looking like? So that was the beginning of my feelings about it. Anyway, I thought maybe I should pass it over and see what you think, Jake.
Yeah. I was thinking that, well, first of all, I thought it was a really clever way to take the like unbelievably complex input data from a video and boil it down into a couple of toggles, which are really musically useful. And I kind of work like that often, of like, I really want to like have sort of like the start of the chain be just a couple of toggles, and then you can make that really complex. So I kind of think it's interesting to have like complex video, simple like mid-level control, and then the music that's coming out of it is pretty complex. But maybe sort of building on what Jan said of trying to find ways of making it a little bit more directly interactive, it might be interesting to find a way to get more toggles out of the video. So that you can have more control of things happening. And that way you can sort of continue working in the same way, right? You don't need to like build a new universe. You're just going to make a more complex universe. So like a couple ideas I had where I don't know a whole lot about jitter, but I think you can pretty easily extract like the 3 color channels or something like that. So maybe you could have like in each of the 2 windows, you could have like red objects trigger a certain toggle and blue and green or something like that. And then your performance of it you could have like some gloves or balls or something like that you sort of pull into the screen as a way to sort of like trigger different things to happen. And the thing I like about that too is that I'm assuming it wouldn't work perfectly, so there would be a little bit of fuzziness there. It wouldn't just be like you're pushing buttons when you bring the objects in. And then I also had the thought that like it seems like you divided it into 2 screens based on a single camera input. So there's no reason you couldn't divide it into many screens, and then sort of like moving around would go through these different zones, which could turn on and off different toggles. So by doing either of those ideas, or I'm sure you could come up with many more versions of ways to make this a little bit more just like have more buttons to push. Then you could just continue making the system more complex. And once you have a couple, you could have interaction between the left and the right screen. So if the left toggle is on, it changes the behavior of the right toggle, et cetera, et cetera. So I don't think it would take too long before the system would feel a little bit like you can kind of do more with it.
Yeah, that's a nice way of putting it. I think, like in a way, I guess what you're describing is the core kind of the responsive music tech bit is kind of there. But it's like now you can just kind of multiply it by 10 and like totally. And make it even more. Every time I see a video, like a kind of webcam style responsive music project, I think of this project that I've not yet been able to track down. Maybe somebody or maybe Martin showed it to me in 2006. I don't know. This like I think it was in some city in Germany, like Hamburg or something, that had a video camera pointed at their harbor, and it was doing very similar thing to what's happening here, where I believe it was like background subtraction, so that anything that changed would then be seen in the video, and then you would see the change and you could identify which pixel it was on and then make stuff response. But then so it was the only thing that made that a cool project. I mean, not the only thing. The thing that made it a really cool project was that it was pointed at a harbor, right? So like the camera was pointed at a harbor. So it wasn't just somebody moving their hand, it was a boat coming along, right? So then it ended up being like this kind of generative, like almost like pseudo algorithmic thing in a way, because it was like you could almost count on things coming in at the right time and everything. And then the musical system was being generated from that. And I think it was probably doing exactly what you're describing, Jake, is just like a thing like this, like boiling a change in pixel or a change in a group of pixels down to a toggle, and then triggering some sound. And like that can be a really powerful thing. Absolutely. And yeah, it kind of just needs, it needs a bit more of that. I totally agree. I wish I could find that project. If anybody knows, I've tried Googling it before, but I'm sure I'm getting the city wrong. I could have sworn it was Hamburg, but yeah.
Yeah, one thing that brings to mind for me, just the idea of this harbor piece where the video itself is an important part of the piece, and tracking the connection between the boats moving and the sounds that come out of it. You could say the same thing about your piece, where tracking the movement of your hands and connecting it to what we hear is really important, which I guess is what we're talking about. But it just makes me think that, like, if you were to take this system and build it into a larger piece, like a live performance or a video, like a recorded video work or something like that, it's, I guess, just worth thinking about, like, what do you do with the visual of you performing, and maybe think about ways to exaggerate that or build it into the piece more. So, like, I don't know, if you were performing this live, I could imagine something with like shadows like pointing up at you, so you could like exaggerating that movement. Or if it was a video work, I don't know, just doing something cool with like the visuals of your hand or something like that. But it's an important part of the piece. It's not just control. It's not just functional. What you're doing with your hands is not just functional. So otherwise you could do it with something else, right? But it's worth thinking about the aesthetics of that and using it for something.
Yeah, totally. And I think that brings up an interesting point about most sort of interface or like motion-based video capture interface systems, is the thing that's like, I think is always important to keep in mind as when you're making these things, that like it is as much for the people watching you as it is for you. Like it is, if you're like, generally speaking, the design of human computer action, for the most part, can be seen as like, or the history of the design of human computer action can kind of be seen as this sort of like this move towards efficiency, right? Like let's bring stuff down to be like the thing that turns on immediately, and the tiny little button that we can press that does everything perfectly, and the one word that we can say that triggers all these responses and all this stuff. A system like this is spectacularly inefficient, right? From an interaction standpoint. And that's what makes it useful and interesting and cool. And so it's kind of like you need to, but so like if you were to if you're trying to compose a piece of music, most composers would not choose to use this system. They would choose to use a system that they can write down the music efficiently or sequence it or whatever. So what ends up happening is that this is really a performance system or an installation system, like these awesome things Martin's posting in the chat, which I don't think it's the same stuff that I'm trying to think of, or maybe I've just made it up. Maybe I've made it up in my head. But and then that fact that this is a thing designed for both audience and performer, and that relationship between performer and audience should kind of really inform what you make as well. That kind of like, what's the sound that comes out of it, and what's the gesture that creates that sound? What's the complexity of it? What's the kind of directness of it? Because it needs to work for you as a performer, but it also needs to work for the audience, because they're equally important in this kind of relationship. Yeah, these are cool projects too. These ones that Martin's posting. In fact, the first one, looks kind of like a public installation version in some ways of this one, which is pretty interesting. Yeah, cool stuff.
Cool. One last thought that I had. I guess this is almost a little separate, but it reminded me of the work of Sarah Bell Reed, who's a trumpet player who works with Macs and works with modular synths and stuff like that. But she has a lot of her work is so that she can play trumpet and not think about the electronics. So she has really clever ways of getting the electronics to respond to what she's doing with her trumpet in a really kind of alive ways. And some of that is with like a sensor augmented trumpet, so that like the valves kind of are controllers, but also a lot of it is just with amplitude tracking and pitch tracking and stuff like that. And anyway, the reason I mention it is that I think if I remember correctly, one technique she's talked about is just really simple, having like a 5-second delay on some control signals, not like an echo delay on the audio, but on the control signal, so that she can like make a big burst, which would trigger some amplitude tracker, which would trigger a gesture a little bit later. So it's super simple, but it makes it so that it's that nice kind of mid-ground between you hear something, you see a response, or you see something, then you get a response from it, but it's not just like they're following each other in direct time. I don't know.
That's super cool.
Yeah, it's really elegant. And anyway, she has a lot of public patches and demo videos and stuff like that. So definitely a good person to look into for this kind of stuff.
Brilliant. I think we're getting to the point now where we could move on to the next piece. Do you have any other final thoughts?
Not too much.
No, some really good discussion. So I'm just going to keep on saying that after everyone, I think. But so moving on, we're going to get the next video up ready for you. This piece is a generative ambient max patch made by Andrew Ramsey. And we're going to play the video for you just now. Excellent. Wanted to leave the 5 seconds of silence at the end there just to allow the full creative vision to unfold. So that was Generative Ambient Max Patch by Andrew. So we're going to invite Andrew. We're going to get him spotlighted here and bring back the panelists, and we can start the discussion there.
Cool. Beautiful work, Andrew. It's a great patch. I love the sound. Let's see. So many thoughts. I'm curious to know a little bit more about what each section of this patch does. But I think maybe the biggest question I have is if you could explain the difference between linear mode and sandbox mode, because it looked like linear mode was on for this video. Is that right? But it looked like you were also interacting with it a lot. So I'm curious to know.
So I was trying to show like a bit of the sandbox mode and the linear mode in the video. So I started it and ended it with the linear mode with like slight interactions, because you can, even though it's in linear mode, you can still like tweak it. But like the scheduled events, basically that will happen like over the 3 minutes of the like mapped out piece will still occur even if you're changing things. So the idea was kind of like you could either do it completely by yourself and like it could go on for like however long you want and like hours and hours, or you can set it to just be in the 3 minute mode. And each time you do click start, it will still change because of like all the randomized parameters, but it'll at least be following like a structure.
Nice. And is the structure programmed into it in linear mode just by changing presets? Is that kind of the main strategy?
Yeah, so like a lot of it's like changing the voice volume of different things and either turning on or turning off like the randomization functions and changing presets.
Gotcha. And then my other question, I'm curious to know, I saw that you're using Ableton for some sounds and you're using Max to generate some of the sounds. And could you sort of just walk through the different sound elements we're hearing and which ones are where? And I'm also just curious to know how you decided to divide those up in that way.
Yeah. So so I have like the wave machine section. So it's like generative waves using pink waves that I've like sculpted to mimic the sound of ocean waves. And then part of the way through linear mode, it also introduces a sample of Portobello Beach just to kind of add that like realness at a certain point to the generatively made waves. And then I have like these sine waves that follow like a harmonic series that kind of like play against each other and create like undulating tones that are made in Max. And then the bass and the drums are basically just sequencers that are controlling a Ableton made sounds. And then the chimes are made from vibraphone samples.
Cool. Okay, so one thought, and then I want to pass it over to Yan. But one way of, I also work between Max and Ableton a lot. And I sort of discovered that workflow a few years ago because I got really tired of building, like I would sit down at Max and I would spend hours building a synthesizer, and then it would be worse than the ones in Ableton and trying to do the same thing. So I was just like, you know what? I like MIDI. I'm fine with this. I'm just going to work with the Ableton instruments most of the time. And then once I started doing that, I spent a lot more time building sequencers and my music got a lot more interesting. So, I just sort of like, I'll use what's already there and then build upon it. But something that I found really useful in that workflow is taking sort of like individual ideas from a big patch and then building them into Max for Live devices so that you can rearrange them or have multiples of them or something like that. So for example, in this patch, you kind of have the whole band built out in a single screen, which is a great interface because it means that you can see everything at once. But I could totally imagine a Max for Live wave machine device and a Max for Live the step sequencer you had for the drums, NMX for live. You could build a sampler with those wind chimes, or I think you had like a stutter effect built into it or something like that. So personally, I find it really useful to sort of take it apart and then put them into individual devices, because then when you move it, if you were to sort of rebuild this in Ableton, then you could have many more pieces where these like little pieces of each instrument in the band is sort of like arranged differently, and you could incorporate different effects and things like that. Just one possible workflow that might be interesting to you. And I also feel like other people would enjoy using these devices. Like the generative step sequencer would be great in Ableton.
Yeah, I think that's a really cool idea. I should definitely get working on that, because I like the modularity of that sounds really fun to mess with. So, because even like in like the sandbox mode, I wouldn't even need to like switch it to that then, because then if I just pull in the wave machine and just pull in the chimes, which is what I would do a lot when I was making it, is just listen to like the waves and the chimes for like a day as I did work to see how it like kind of unfolded. I could easily just then take those two patches and swap them in Ableton and see what happens.
Right. Or you could have 10 of the chimes.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, I think that's really, really good advice. I think, splitting things out is really great practice. And I think long-term more, it can be really rewarding creatively to then just feel like, I'm going to do a piece with just 10 of these sequencers, or whatever. And then like, especially when you start being able to kind of expand, the kind of the scale of things, or expand very far in one direction, but then kind of come back to some other direction. So yeah, I think that's really cool. I'm curious overall, because did you set out to make this with a sort of design, with like a goal in mind, like a fixed kind of idea at the outset?
Not really. This is like my first time really like experimenting with Max MSP for the course. So I kind of just like over time was like I'd be like, oh, let me try this. And I would like make the wave machine. I'd be like, oh, this sounds really cool. And then I'd be like, oh, what if I add this to it? And then eventually I was like, oh, I should add drums and bass and like incorporate like the MIDI stuff. And so it kind of developed over time, which I think even makes more sense going back to like the modular part.
Yeah, I think I think my question is leading in the same direction, basically, is that it's like, you've ended up like making this thing that fits in really tightly and nicely as a giant cohesive whole. But I think you could also probably distance yourself from that a bit now that you've kind of, managed to get that far, which is, fantastic. And and you kind of understand it, and you understand each core part. Now I think you could start pulling it back apart and thinking about each individual thing, which I think you might, it may actually help you as well think about either, I don't know, unifying the design of them more, or considering different parameters that you might not have thought about, because you're actually kind of trying to fit it into this one big, because like basically you've created a single composition, right? Like you've created a single composition that is generative and changes, and it can change and everything, but it's like a fixed thing. And I think it could be really cool to move it now to the next level, where it's like you can use these tools to make any number of compositions, right? So like that could be a really cool thing to do. I'd also encourage you to think a lot about the interface design. I feel like I constantly come back to the same 2 points whenever I give any criticism, but like currently, this happens whenever you use any tool. Like whenever you use any tool to make something, you end up using the toolbox, right? And right now, like you're using the Max toolbox, and that's great because it's there and it's in front of you. What can be hard with Max is to move beyond the tools that it gives you, because they're really good. They're like really nice. They work really well. Like, why wouldn't you use them? But I do think that it can end up kind of blinkering the interaction you have. Like, could you make a step sequencer that is not a bunch of toggles? Could you make I can't remember like the other bits of the interface, but like, or like, can you make it so that you don't see the waveforms of each sound, or, like things like that, where these choices are made for you by cycling 74, and that's cool, and they know what they're doing, and it's really useful. But also, like, I think there's this kind of, if you could push through it and think like, okay, what is it I'm trying to do? Like, what's my goal? Like, is the goal to like not have control? Is the goal to have control? Is the goal to be able to, like, that really cool, like somebody mentions in the chat, I totally agree, this really cool balance between like sort of linear composition and also being able to muck with it while it's happening. Like, that's really cool. Okay, so then what's the right kind of action that you want to have to do in order to make that happen? You know, so like, I think now it's hard to do that in Max. Like I say, it's really tricky. And I think you might find if you do start moving stuff over to Max for Live, you may end up starting to change how you approach stuff in general, because there's a whole other set of interface objects that's offered for that, right? And then Ableton is, you know, they want everything to look the same. So it's, you know, you're going to use the little yellow and gray like toggle boxes instead of, and so like it forces you into a different direction, but that might be good. It might be good just to kind of like, okay, how do I make all of this, but make it fit into that like weirdly long rectangle, and like use just the like orange and black dots instead of the toggles? Like, I think that might be quite a good exercise to like, yeah, to help get past that. I'm just looking at my notes. Yeah, I think. Oh, and the other thing is like, I'm a big fan of limitations. Like, I would also say like, you know, experiment, like, especially if you're making if you push into this kind of modular approach to things, like, could you have something that does exactly the same kind of like concept, but like you have one slider, you know, like what would that be like? Because then I think you can retain a lot of the work that you've done and a lot of the thought that you've put into this kind of generative stuff. And that's really cool. And then I think it could be an interesting exercise. You might not want to end up using it, but you just as an exercise for yourself, like, okay, what happens if you have, or no controls at all, right? Like, just like, this is a sequencer, it will sequence it. You have no control over it. That's it. Like, okay, what would that look like, right? What's that? See, and then I think you would start to understand also the character of the thing you're making. Right, because you're not making a neutral thing. I think this is like with any tool that you make, even if you have all of the controls, or if you have none of the controls, or anything, all of the mappings you're doing, the way you're laying it out, all this stuff, it's you. Like, you're the one making those decisions, and that's good. Like, I think it's good to lean into that and be like, okay, now I'm making a thing that is just like, if I've made all of the decisions, what would that look like? What would that sound like? What am I giving up? What control am I giving up? What's being done for me? All that kind of thing. So like, I'm a big fan of limiting those sets of controls as well. So I'd encourage you to do that too, as part of this kind of next set of explorations, wherever you go with it. Yeah, those were my thoughts. I thought it was really great.
Thanks. Yeah, I really like that. I do think like UI design is hard because of that fact that it like makes you really pay attention to like, what are you trying to say through this, and how can I then like express that through the UI kind of thing. So
yeah, and you know, Max makes it particularly hard. Like, I think it's definitely a thing to struggle with, and if you're aware of the struggle, it makes it a little easier.
Yeah.
But yeah, it is there.
Yeah, those are really, I love all of those thoughts. One kind of game that I've played with myself in Max is like, give myself an assignment. Like, I want to make a sequencer that is controlled by one button with like a MIDI key. I have one MIDI key with aftertouch, and that's all I get to use. And like, how expressive can I make that? Or two sliders or something like that. But just sort of like, and a cool way to do this for you, Andrew, might be to take this project as it is, and then say, I want to control this project with only that much, or something like that, rather than saying like starting from scratch. Well, I guess that's exactly the idea that Jan said, but it is fun to just take it as like assignment, like how far can I take it with just one thing? And then I had, this, I'm going to sort of like a sort of separate thought, but I was thinking about the difference between these different approaches of either sort of breaking it out into a bunch of things or trying to make it feel more unified. And then also, like Jan was saying, like this idea of, do you want to have a lot of control over it, or do you want it to kind of be more mysterious and self-driving and random? And for me, when I break things out and work in Max for Live, I feel like it's each, there's certain benefits to that, whatever. But if you're going to build this like master control window, kind of like you have it set up right now, when I work like that, one of my favorite things to do is try to make sure that all of the different elements are affecting each other. So one thing you might think about is, rather than using preset to like sort of like each box of the UI is controlled by one preset thing that's randomized. And so they're just sort of like things that sound nice together, but they're all kind of their own worlds, is just find really simple ways to have them affect each other. Like if the volume of the noise machine crosses a certain threshold, it triggers a different probability in the drums. Or every time like one of the random, one toggle in the drum sequencer goes off, it triggers a sequence of the vibraphone sounds or something like that. But I had this problem in a project where I was sort of working on the master patch to do it all, where I had something like 8 different instruments, and I was like, I'm going to be really organized in this project. So I put them all in separate sub-patchers, and it was so boring because every time I went to change something, it was just like, all right, like that's just another idea. And then I sort of scrapped the project and rebuilt it in one giant messy patch. And the individual parts were way simpler, but I just sort of like built this little network of things that would change each other. And it felt a lot better to me. It felt, I guess the thing I am trying to say is the idea of it all existing in one application felt like it had more of a reason to be there, right? Because you can network things. So I guess, yeah, like Jan was saying, like do some soul searching on what kind of control you want to have, and then lean in one direction or the other, or just try both and see what feels right.
Yeah, I think that's really cool. I'm definitely going to have to, I think, try both, because I think like it would be really cool to have them separate, but then if I'm putting them together, why am I doing that? Makes sense. So it's like they should all be together, like actually, and not just like it's thrown together kind of a thing. So
cool.
Makes a lot of sense.
By the way, you don't have to choose. I do both.
Yeah.
I guess it just helps to choose per project.
Yeah.
The only thing I'd add to that is like also to kind of now dial back on some of what I was saying earlier. Like, I think it's great to try to design tools that are like super flexible and can be applied to anything. I also think it's really cool to design like hyper specific tools, just make a, wind chime sequencer. That's it. Like, and I think there's something really cool about like what from a design standpoint, what that can really offer you is like, is this focus, because otherwise like you can get lost being like, why am I doing this? Like, why am I making, like, what do I want to get out of this sequencer? And it's like, well, like thinking about that's like a systems design problem, right? And that's interesting and that can be cool. But also if you just want to play with a sound, there's nothing wrong with that. Like there's, you can kind of like what if you made the perfect, woodblock sequencer, or like, something like that, which can be like, it again ends up being weirdly modular because you could drop that into any project, you can make it, but like having a laser focus is also really cool. Like some of my favorite things that I've made are things that are just like that do one thing and that's it, like nothing else. And I think there is something quite cool about that too. So like there's a number of different approaches to it. They're all very deliberate, but like I don't like it can be dangerous to think like I'm going to make the one greatest tool that I'll be able to use in 25 different things. So there's a balance there.
Totally agree with that. I found it sort of freeing to embrace the idea of the patch is a piece rather than the patch is an instrument. So you make the ultimate woodblock sequencer, and that's the piece. You turn it on and it plays the piece, and that's it. And then and sure, like you could use it, you could incorporate it into other things, but it's kind of freeing to not think to not put the design challenge on yourself to have it be flexible and universal. It's funny though, because we've sort of given you the exact, like, the two poles of this advice, like make it universal, make it not universal. But I guess it's just like you could do either of those things, and it's it would be great ways of working.
Yeah.
I'm afraid I'm going to have to jump in. So that's about our time for that submission. But yeah, really, again, surprise, wonderful conversation, really cool. And thank you again, Andrew, for submitting that work.
Yeah, thank you guys.
Thanks a bunch.
Great. So the next and the final submission for this event is actually some work made by me. So I have to awkwardly introduce myself
Welcome,
a bit.
Jack.
Yeah. And even more embarrassingly, I think I actually introduce it again in the video. So I'll just pass over to past me and let him take it from here. This is a demonstration video for a work in progress project that I'm currently working on. It's investigating physical sound interactions, and specifically it's interested in researching the experience of fun and other kinds of meaning that we put onto physical sound interactions in gallery spaces or installations. So I imagine these interactions taking place eventually in an art gallery space. At the moment, I'm using a leap motion infrared camera, which is connected to track my hands in a Unity application that I made that sends the data from the camera to an OSC port, which I'm then reading from in a Max patch. So I'm going to show quickly two different prototype interactions that I have set up at the moment. The first is just using both hands to control two different FM synthesizers. And then the second is using pulse waves and saw waves just to use formant filters to make different vowel sounds. So I'll play those two different demos now. Okay, great. Thank you, past Jack. I'm really really embarrassed by how bored I look during those videos. I can confirm it was just concentration, but yeah. So I'll open it back to the panelists for impressions, unless you have any more questions or anything for me.
Maybe questions will come up, as I'm not sure. Yeah, I don't have it. This isn't one that I had sort of direct immediate questions on. I did have a lot of thoughts on it. I guess one question, I guess, is what made you start using the Leap? Was this kind of like a tech led thing, or did you? How did you start this project?
Mm-hmm. So I actually started this project with the kind of tail end of a previous one that was using Jitter and Maximus P to track colors.
Okay.
And I was tracking different colored ping pong balls that were floating in water. And I was kind of happy with how that was working. And then I wanted to develop it to kind of a sort of slightly more like varied gesture controlled thing. So I had the ping pong balls on a stick and I was waving them about. But really quickly I realized that the jitter seemed to, or at least my jitter setup had problems with tracking fast movements. So that sent me on a kind of route of just looking for different technical solutions for tracking fast movements. And the Leap Motion was just one of the first things that I came across that I could get my hands on. And when I tried it out, it seemed so responsive that I just sort of took it and ran with it. So it was kind of technical that led me to it.
Cool. Yeah. Okay. That's interesting. Just taking a note of what you just said. The first thing I thought when you in the very beginning of the video is I was like, the stupidest thing that I reacted to. I was like, oh man, it's really nice that it's like, I guess velocity based is the sound or something, because so like when you stop moving, the sound goes silent like that. And it's amazing how simple that feels. And yet it's very effective because it means like you can hold your hand still and there's no sound. And that was just like a very strong kind of sonic interaction thing, was actually managing silence, because managing silence in anything that involves movement is very hard, because especially kind of anything that involves direct mapping of movement, because the instinct is always like, okay, X coordinate will be volume and Y coordinate will be pitch or whatever. And it's like, so that means you always have to go down, like there always has to be a fade away kind of thing, whereas you're able to do this movement. So that I thought was really effective. And I think the kind of multiple in the synth one, I thought that kind of the multiple like modulation wave thing happening was also really effective, because it means there's kind of like multiple things for my ears to latch onto. There's these different pitches, and the way they kind of are interacting with each other gives it some nice depth that I wasn't really expecting. The one thing I did think, like, I don't know what made me think of this, but you know what? I do know what made me think of this is watching this just now on Zoom. There's actually a funny delay, which in the video that I watched ahead of time, I can see that the sound and the movement is like super instantaneous. Watching it on Zoom, sadly, there's actually a bit of latency, and so it looks like you're making the movement. But that actually made me think of what Jake said earlier with Sarah Reed's trumpet data delay thing. Like, oh man, in a funny way, there's something interesting there about like having, maybe you could be responding to a ghost hand of your past, like also like kind of like make the movement, and then like somewhere off in the distance, like I could almost imagine like that's how you could make a delay, like an audio delay, right? Like you could, and then like in the distance, you can see a sort of ghostly representation of your hand doing it like 200 milliseconds after. And then if there's any feedback on the delay, then 200 milliseconds after that, there's an even more distant, quieter hand, and then you could have this like in when you close mirrors together and you get these multiple hands. I think there's an interesting set of, visual auditory links that you could make with the data and your hands, and I think that could be really cool. And it just kind of like suddenly I was like, oh, there's this whole extra thing that I hadn't really thought of. Well, I'll say the two other things I was going to say, and then I'll pass it over to Jake because I think there's a lot more to say. But the first thing I was going to say, the vowel thing, like that was fucking awesome. Like, I totally, really, really like. Suddenly, that was something I had not expected at all. Like that, I was like, this is super interesting. Have you seen the pink trombone? Has everybody seen the pink trombone? Okay.
I think so. Anyone
who has not seen the pink trombone should now see the pink trombone. It is one of the world's great sound toys. It's a speech synthesis tool where you can like play with like, oh God, I'm playing it right now on my headphones and it's very hard to talk at the same time. But you can control every element of speech synthesis by like moving, and you can make it completely absurdist as well. Like you can stick the tongue way out, and then you can make the lips like massive, and you can make the wobble completely nonsensical. But it has this kind of uncanny valley-ish vocal sound thing of like, yeah, it sounds like a voice, and you're controlling the physical nature of the voice. It's like this kind of physical model, sort of. It's based with some kind of AI stuff. I don't even know how it works, but like it's totally absurd, but like hilarious and wonderful and amazing. And it definitely, I was like, oh man, you could have you could really map the controls to fingers, of this thing, and then start getting like really tightly grained, like totally horrible sounding. I've like, have you seen those like physical speech synthesizers where there's like lips and they talk? Like those things are horrible, right? They're like amazingly horrible, and yet they're like super compelling to watch. And like, I think you could lean into that world. And then I was like, oh man, you could even turn this into like a game. Like what if like there's a word on the screen and you have to like say the word with your hands, like say the word like, I don't know, coffee, and it's like, coffee or whatever. Like it would be so like, I don't know how you would guess like, I don't know how you would measure whether it's successful or not, but maybe it doesn't even matter. Like who cares? Like just like try it, and like who can do it. And like, there's a whole kind of like game thing there, which I think is super interesting. So there's more thoughts I had on that. And then the last thing I was going to say, because I've been talking a lot, is just like technically, is there any specific reason you'd use Max, or is there, because I would, my technical brain immediately went to like, Unity OSC to Max feels like a pain to me. I would just like, I think it would be great to have an audio engine thing embedded into Unity. And then I was thinking, if you're using Max, you could use PD, and then you could use a libpd integration. Then it's just one package and you don't need to worry about OSC and all that stuff. So I don't know if that's something you've already looked into and rejected, or are scared of, or whatever, which is fine too. But there is that possible technical option, unless I'm misunderstanding or overlooking something that you're doing that requires Max.
No, that's a cool point. I think I kind of, and one thing I'd be interested to hear about the thoughts on was, originally I was kind of conceptualizing it as just a kind of an interaction without any visual element. So but then I kind of, as I've gone on, I've realized actually it's really helpful, and also maybe more playful in a kind of clear feedback way of having the hands visible. But I think because of that, I just never really thought about keeping it in Unity. I always wanted it. And I also just thought that Max would be easiest for me to kind of prototype in quickly. But yeah, that's a really cool point about just, bundling it as a game engine thing so that people could just open it as an application as well. Because I really like the idea of being able to bundle it and send it to people, and as long as they have Elite Motion, they could just plug it in and play around with it.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, Jake, go ahead.
Yeah, cool. I love the idea of making it a game and trying to say words with your hands. That sounds really fun. And also kind of thinking in the context of your broader concept of like bringing fun into a gallery type space, I feel like, that's a really neat way of doing it. Although it's interesting to think about like what makes sense in a gallery in terms of like, should it feel like a game? Is there something you can do that would make it, I don't know, that would just like respond to that context differently? But one idea building upon that I had was, well, I was thinking that if you want to sort of like make it fun or something, it would be cool if this feels interactive between multiple people, because I'm imagining a gallery space having sort of like a bunch of people taking turns and then doing like sort of a short performance on it. It could be just like much more fun if two people get up and then they have to like figure out how to do something together. So here's my game: is you have like a short training session where you teach people how to make like how to have a little bit of control over the vocal sounds, and then you have to like separate them into very separate spaces and have them have a conversation or something like that. Like,
it's an escape room. So you have like like one birthday, each room has a lock on it with a code, and the people in each room have the code to the other lock. And so you have to like communicate what the lock is to each other, but you can hear each other's like synth hands. Yeah.
There it is. There's the idea. Okay, we're done.
Oh, hilarious. And then everybody can watch from the outside also. You have to be able to watch and hear both sides.
I like that.
Crucial.
Yeah. Okay. So that's one idea. I really love that. This is now a separate idea that I had. So a lot of what I do is using like really simple MIDI controller, like faders and knobs, and trying to figure out how to get as much interesting control stuff out of that as possible. So something that I do a lot is like I'll take a fader and it will be like a continuous control, like a lot of the parameters in the things coming out of Unity. But then I'll also make it so that being at the minimum is a toggle, so you can turn something on and off, and being at the maximum is a toggle, so you can turn a separate thing on and off. And you can have it sort of strum through a bunch of buttons in the middle when you cross a bunch of thresholds. And those are sort of the main things I do to like milk as much stuff out of a single continuous control parameter, but I'm sure you could come up with a lot of others. Actually, another one that I've figured out is calculating like the velocity of how hard you hit the minimum or the maximum. And then that's like another thing. And you could think of all sorts of things like that. But because the interface is limited, well, there's so much there, but because it's limited to what is it, like the three spatial dimensions, and then the hand movement, and then the velocity, which actually is a lot of control. But you could so maybe I'm just telling you to make it too complicated, but it just seems like there's more stuff you could do with that. And thinking about this being in, again, just like the fun idea of it being in a gallery space, it might be interesting to have a little bit more, some more things happening in the space that you're interacting with that are a little bit harder to understand, so that there's a little bit of like a discovery game happening. So for example, let's say, this idea of having like little trigger points, you could make it so that when your hand is like in the top left corner of the space, it like makes something happen. And then if your right hand is in one particular space and your left hand goes there, so it makes it like, it's not just that you're controlling a synth, it makes it that you're like sort of feeling around in a space, and like you have to uncover all the little ghosts in that space. So I guess that's kind of a separate game idea, but it seems like something you could do without, I guess it's like, it's not that much more complicated, and you're just sort of taking advantage of the control data that you've already built out.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Sorry, my brain's kind of already going to like thinking about all those, but yeah, that's really cool.
Yeah, go ahead. Sorry, go ahead.
No, please.
Go. What was I going to say? Yeah, it's interesting. It's like I think with the leap motion, you have such direct control and such direct and precise kind of location output that like it ends up creating another set of challenges, I think is kind of how I see that. And like my instinct is like, that's like too much. Like I don't like, I want to actually kind of break it, a little bit. And so when you mentioned gallery in the in the write-up or something about it. Yeah. Like my instinct was like, oh, wouldn't it be fun if it was like, if it wasn't my hands controlling something, but I was controlling some other hands, those like those kid toys where you squeeze a thing and there's like a little hand at the end that plays. Like, would it be funny if that was the hand that was being controlled? So then it's like putting something in between me and this like hyper precise data track. I don't even know if that would work. Like, but like maybe if you put a glove on it or something, I don't know. But like, having, in a way, I kind of love the sort of like like a little adding a bit of noise, a little bit of messiness in it. But I actually think Jake's idea is better. Like you could have it, be you can use that kind of hyper precise data points within space thing to its advantage as an exploratory thing. I think that is super interesting.
Yeah, it is interesting because it's one of the kind of biggest issues that I've faced with it so far is trying to manage. And it's kind of like what you were saying earlier, Jan, about the the decision of how clear to make the connections between what was going on. Yep. Because the leap motion also gives you data on the rotation of the hands, which again is just seems like a really cool thing to map. But then when I was trying to do that with position data controlling things as well, it instantly was kind of, to me at least, making it slightly harder to work out what was causing what. Yeah. And yeah, so I spent a lot of time so far trying to think of what levels, which things to make sound and stuff, which is kind of why for the vowel one, I settled on just having the opening and closing of the fists, because it felt like quite a nice expressive movement, but at the same time, there's basically two sliders in terms of the data. So it was a kind of nice limitation to have. I think we've probably just got a few minutes before we should head into a Q&A period. So if you have any final statements or any final thoughts, or if you're happy to wrap it up there for this piece.
I guess my final thought is probably just going to open up a bigger conversation. So feel free to just not do this, but I was very curious to hear more about the idea of bringing something fun into a gallery space. I wonder, I don't know, maybe if you could just say something about that for a minute.
It's I guess it is a bit of a big thing, but I think my approach with it was I was just trying to think about something I'd be really keen to spend a lot of time doing project wise, and the first thing that came to mind was something physical, gesture controlled. And then when I was trying to sort of work backwards from that, being like, well, what's the project about if I'm trying to do this? What's drawing me to these interactions, to this setup, to these sound experiences? And the thing that I kind of kept thinking but not wanting to write up in my kind of official academic documentation was that they're just really fun and really exciting and they can be really silly, and they can be kind of personal as well, because you get to be a part of it. And I think that's one of the things that I love about gallery spaces and installations in gallery spaces as well, is the fact that you are in some way activating it, and you get to kind of play with those things of how you can, if it's activated by moving your hands, how can you move your hands in the most ridiculous way possible, but still achieve the sort of highbrow artistic response to your silly, funny movement. And so I kind of, I decided to embrace that, because I felt like it was what was so special about these kind of things for me. And I thought, wouldn't it be cool if I actually made that the research focus and came out of this project somehow slightly more informed on how that works for me.
Yeah, I think that's super interesting. I think the last thought I would have is just responding slightly to the thing you said before about turning upside down and closing your hand and that kind of stuff. And I think what it makes me think of is the sort of mainly industrial design concept of affordances. So like the idea that like an object will afford you a certain type of interaction with it, right? So like if you have, the door, a door that has one of those flat panels, the affordance there is pushing, right? Because you look at it, you feel like you can push it. It feels correct to push it. If it's mounted in the right way, you push it. You don't even think about it. It affords you that. And I think the reason I often end up thinking about a lot about the tools that are used to make sound things is that I do feel like every tool, and all going down to software and stuff as well. It's like what I was mentioning before about the interface design of Macs and everything. All of these things have affordances that are built into them, and it's really useful to be super aware of that, right? And work with them or against them, or try to ignore them or try to use them, or it doesn't necessarily mean you have to use them, but just being really aware of it. And I think the Leap is a very strong example of affordances, because it kind of is like, it gives you all this stuff, and it's like, it sort of is kind of implying that it's a neutral hand tracker, but it's not a neutral hand tracker. It's giving you your fingertips, and it has assumed that you want to know hand rotation. And so it's giving you that. And so you feel like you have to use it. But like, in a way, I think you've like using the closing of your hands leading into that more was a very good choice, because from a sound design perspective and a sound interaction perspective, closing your hand for me definitely has that kind of filtering feel. It works. That connection is very strong, and so like having that form filtering or whatever you're doing on the voice thing, for example, when you close your hand, like you don't even notice it happening because it's such a strong interaction. Like, that it just, the sound has changed. You've seen the thing, your brain makes the connection. You don't even think about it. Afterwards, you're like, oh yeah, okay, that's how I control it. So these kind of this link between the tool affordances, then the sound design and link between the interaction and the action you do, and that sort of affordance resulting in the sound. And what happens is like, that's a whole path to kind of think through. And I think you've started doing a really good job of that already in this. I just want to kind of continue that.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much. Those are really, really lovely points and ideas for me to run with. I haven't really thought through how I'm going to segue back into host mode, but thank you so much for those thoughts. And that's all of our submissions gone through for the event. So once again, thank you to all the participants for submitting those works. It's really cool to see and to hear how the conversations can like be so broad and become so abstract and interestingly conceptual from kind of one single point that the piece provides, to see how it all ends up bringing in so many other cool parts of sound design and sound technologies. So now we still have about 15 minutes for a Q&A session with our panelists. So as Helena said, if anyone has any questions, feel free to pop them in the chat. I think we can also feel free to open it up to audience members if you want to turn your camera and your microphone on for a moment and ask a question directly. I don't see any reason why we can't do that. So feel free to jump in. I also have some questions here that prepared just in case. And
start with those. Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, why don't we jump in with one of those? So a pretty general question that we thought might provide some interesting conversation was talking about some of the biggest challenges when working on projects that are so rooted in the sort of intersection of both technology and creative design, and the kind of balance between some of the different challenges and the different ways of working that those two conceptual areas might encourage in a creator. So I was wondering if you could share any of your experiences with that and thoughts on that.
I have one thought right away, which is like, I think our relationship, like as I say, the kind of the royal we of people who, work within not just sound, but all of these kinds of creative fields and technology in particular, is this kind of like the minefield of like constantly learning new tools and kind of being on the sort of like, there are a lot of ways of framing this as an issue, but I think, it's like there's, a painter doesn't have to like relearn how paint works, every time they want to do a new project. Whereas I think there can be an issue when you're working with interactive sound or, any form of creative technology, of being like, okay, great, I'm going to use this project to learn, I don't know, the Arduino, or I'm going to use this project to learn some new hardware or some new software, or I'm going to learn Touch Designer for this project or whatever. And it's like, it can be really frustrating for me anyway, because it's kind of like I'm constantly wanting to learn all this new stuff that's coming up and coming out. And like, it does get, there's several sides to that. Like, first of all, I probably don't need to, like, I probably don't even need, like, I could just use the knowledge I already have. It does get easier because you start seeing these tools as just different versions of the same thing. But also like, yeah, it can slow things down, which is kind of an ironic thing, because as technology is supposed to speed things up for us, right? But instead you're like kind of slowing down to relearn some new thing, and then you do a bad version of it in your first project. And then so you're like I feel like sometimes I have to stop myself from constantly starting over, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I feel like, kind of bouncing off of that response, a problem that I often have is not making any actual music because I'm working on building patches or learning things. But sometimes I forget to, like I'm always like, oh, what can this do? What can this do? How can I keep adding to it? And I lose track of like actually making something with it. So I've found it useful to, I mean, this is kind of how I use Instagram, is to force myself to make a demo of every patch that I make, so that there's like some little piece of music, and it's nice that it's low stakes and whatever, and I can get some feedback and blah, blah, blah. But I still lose track of like then kind of doing what I actually want to do with it, which would, like making something larger, and I'll sort of move on to the next one. But yeah, I guess that's maybe when I'm working in this type of space where it's like I kind of have to think of myself as an instrument or like some sort of designer and also as a composer, is forgetting to compose music. And I have not solved that problem because I haven't written music in too long. But I guess the best solution I have is like inventing deadlines for myself, whether it's just to make a demo to put somewhere for just because, or like to have an idea for like an album I want to make, or have a show coming up or something like that. But yeah, that's something I'm always wrestling with.
Yeah, that's very interesting. It reminds me a lot of the talk that Martin did recently on avoiding sound, and the trouble as a sound designer of getting distracted or almost enjoying the tool design too much. We've actually got a question in the chat from Maria, so I'll just read this out. I'm interested in user interfaces and how they influence accessibility to sound technology. I was wondering how you as an educator perceive how UI affects someone enjoying or not learning. Affects how someone enjoying or not learning sound technology, and any thoughts you have on that subject. She's mentioned Jake specifically. So Jake, would you like to start with any thoughts on that question? It is also written out in the chat. I realize I kind of tripped over it quite a lot if you need to read it.
So let's see. So user interfaces as making something more approachable and more accessible to more people. Let's see. I mean, as an educator, I'm not sure if I have a super clean answer to this question. When I'm making a user interface that I'm planning to share with other I guess I like to think about how the interface encourages interaction with certain elements over others. Things as simple as like making certain knobs bigger than other ones, or more like deciding if labeling something is clear or more poetic, and how that might encourage people to interact with it. Or one of the things that we've mentioned a bunch today is like not allowing certain parameters to be accessible. Like for example, in one of my devices, there's a big sequencer in the middle of it. Actually, I guess multiple devices of mine have a big sequencer in the middle that you're not allowed to actually program, because I want the idea of the device to be that you have to navigate something that's already there rather than design something. So, okay,
Yeah.
but the idea of making it.
I think Maria's just said that she could open her mic and elaborate a bit more on the question. So Maria, if you'd like to do that.
Hi, yes, sorry. I know now that I worded the question very weirdly, so it was weird to read. Sorry, Jack. So my question was more towards, I know that you've taught music technology, you teach music technology. So it was more towards like, if you've perceived that teaching certain technologies that have certain UIs have like put up people of like learning about them specifically, or if you've noticed that there are certain UIs that are more like user friendly for students and stuff like that.
Yeah. Okay. I understand. Great question. So the classes that I teach are usually for people who are starting with music technology for the first time. And sometimes they have prior music experience, and sometimes they don't. And so a big part of the beginning of the classes is usually helping people decide which DAW they want to choose. And I've had very good luck with getting people started on Ableton. Something about the Ableton interface, I think, is really deep for advanced users and also really approachable for beginners. One thing that I think is challenging is that it doesn't have the like skeuomorphic design of looking like a mixer or something like that. So, the idea of this arbitrary gray rectangle represents panning can be tricky for people getting started. But on the other hand, I find things like the drum rack, the way that the drum rack is designed is really intuitive for people to understand how to put together a sampler instrument, or like programming MIDI patterns. Something about the way the piano roll grid works and the way that you can fold it to only look at the important notes or instruments. I find that really helps people. So, like for example, I find that people who don't have any prior musical experience can, like, if you just put it in a certain key and then put some notes out and then see how it works, that's a really good way for people to make the DAW more accessible to other people. That being said, all the DAWs have that, or many of the DAWs, Logic especially, has those kinds of features that turn a DAW into a more of a learning tool than just a kind of like music production tool. Does that kind of answer some of your question?
Yes, thank you.
I definitely have a lot of thoughts on this stuff too. Like I find that the interface design of music software is like such a mess for a lot of reasons. Like, I think there's this kind of funny skeuomorphic thing, it was odd. And I think, I don't think it's any accident that somebody like Ableton comes in and attempts a different workflow and a different set of kind of norms, and people love it. I'm old enough to remember the most popular pre-Ableton software for that kind of market was Fruity Loops, which did a really similar thing, right? Which was like totally not non-linear, non-mixers, none of that stuff. And people loved it. And like recording studio people were super snooty about it and they hated it, right? Because they were like, oh, well, you can't actually have like inserts and shit. And it was like, okay, but nobody cared, it's like they're using it. And I think what that kind of to me points to is this a much bigger question, is that there's like music software and music hardware, like the music design has a lineage, it goes way back, and it's weighed down by this history, it's weighed down by like all these issues. I'll put a link here of something that I noticed the other day in Logic, which is like, so Logic has these things to make it easier for you, right? Like, it's like, okay, look, you can get a drummer now and the drummer plays along with you, except you load the drummers in and they're all men, like every single one of them. Like, so this thing is like, I actually ended up counting it up and they're 80% of the fake robot drummers are men. Like, why did they need to gender these drummers? Like, this is insane, right? And yet they're fake robots. And yet they did, and they gave them little pictures and little mustaches and the whole thing. And that's because like the people who designed this grew up with that, and they're like, they grew up with that as the norm and they're okay with it. It doesn't even occur to them that like this should maybe be something different, right? Like, so there's this like way, and you kind of, when you're in an educational setting, it can be hard to see direct correlations with that, but you do see it. You do see this kind of like, you open up a bit of music stuff for people who don't feel a kind of comfort level with being overwhelmed with like virtual faders and stuff. Will definitely shrink back and they'll be like, maybe this isn't really my thing. Maybe I'd rather use Photoshop or something. And then they just don't do sound, and then they move away. And so like there are these kinds of barriers that I would say are built in, that like all the way down. There's a really great book about it. I'd suggest if you'd called Pink Noises, by Tara Rogers. I don't know what a good link to use is, but anyway, Pink Noises, which kind of does, it's basically a set of interviews, but the opening chapter is a really great analysis of like the biases that are built into a lot of these systems. And I think there's a lot to kind of pull away from that I think is worth really paying attention to.
Thank you. I think it's in the library.
Cool. Get it. Yeah, it's great. Super great. The intro is like mind-boggling, like super great. It's the interviews are good too, but a little less interesting to read, but the intro is like super great.
Thank you.
Great. I think we might try and squeeze in just one last question. We've got one here that was about goalless exploration in your own kind of personal practices and stuff. So how do you weigh the kind of importance of exploring sound tech, sound composition stuff without a specific goal versus, also still managing all the projects that you might have on the go that have a very specific deadline or goal that you have to reach?
I guess I've been trying to incorporate goalless exploration into my process more over the past few years, partially as a way to kind of recapture some pure joy that is missing.
Rushed out of you.
Like I remember, playing in bands in high school, and that was fun. And that was the magic that got me started. And I sometimes miss, like sometimes I'm lacking that same feeling. So to have a part of your practice where it's like only fun and really just enjoying the sound, I think is really important. But for me personally, just my personality type, I do like to have a goal. So I think the way that I navigate this is to have just a lot of low stakes goals that I can meet, and that sort of is like fun, but also has a bit of a target. So like, for example, I like to sit down when I have extra time and do like a 10-minute beat challenge where I'll start the timer and see how much I can do in 10 minutes. And then I work for an hour, but it's still kind of nice to see how far you can get in that amount of time. Or like I mentioned earlier is just like having these, like when I'm working on a patch, it's like, all right, I want to get it far enough that I will want to post it on Instagram. And there's just like something about having a destination that works for me. So yeah, I find that low stakes goals do the same thing for me as not having a goal at all.
Yeah, that's a really good way of putting it. I definitely work much better if I have some kind of like thing to work towards in mind. Like I think the kind of, but I don't necessarily think that that is different from free-form exploration either. Like I think it's like, there's no real such thing as total free-form exploration, right? You're not being like dropped into a desert and then saying like, okay, great, go make a max patch or something. Like it's, there is always going to be boundaries, and it's kind of like, and I guess, yeah, I'm not sure how good I am at formally setting those boundaries. It's certainly not as good as Jake, I think, but I think, I do end up finding myself, I think the small scale stuff is probably where some of the best learnings come out, like a little exploration on, or I just want to explore what it's like to just explore like controlling only time or something. Like I only control time, and then a lot of times it ends up being tied into some kind of technical exploration too. Like, okay, is it possible for me to use, this type of code on this type of device, or is it possible to use this kind of, to build my own little microphone or build, things like that. And then, but I also, within that, I tend to really like having some kind of finishing point. And that can be the simplest thing. Like the thing I did yesterday, it's in a Marks and Spencer's biscuit tin. This thing is stupid as hell. Like it's got one button on it. That's it. But like, what was like, I was testing a couple things, like how long can this run on the battery and what kind of processing speed and everything. I didn't need to have it in a box, but for me, it helps me just like, okay, now I can sit on it and actually listen to it and actually see what it does. And that kind of thing is really helpful for me. And then, I think it's worth not understating also the ability to show it to people, have a thing like, hey, this is the thing I worked on. You want to see it? Whether that's on social media or in person or whatever, it helps a lot. I definitely manage things that way as well.
Well, I have one other thought about this, which is a way to make larger projects that has worked for me is to always record something when I'm doing something freeform and sort of playful and goalless, and then have a big folder of sounds that I made, and then just make a sound collage out of them. Works like I found that worked really, really well. That may be the only way I can work that actually works. Because once the stakes are high, it's really hard to make those decisions. But if you have a pile of sounds that have some kind of like spontaneity and good stuff going on, it's really easy to start from that point. Just make an album that represents the past couple of months of whatever you were doing.
Yeah, brilliant. Loads of really cool stuff. Unfortunately, we're reaching the end of the allotted time for this event, so I'm going to have to put a stopper on the great conversation. But thank you everyone for coming along and attending. Thank you again to the participants for submitting your work, and thank you to our lovely panelists Jan and Jake for joining us and giving all of that amazing feedback and insight into this really cool world of sound. And thank you again to the Student Experience Grant at the University of Edinburgh for making this festival possible with the funding. It's really, really wonderful to be able to have this opportunity to bring our kind of conversations from the university about sound out into the sphere a little bit, and then post this online and archive these really cool, fun conversations. The only thing left on my to-do list is to say goodbye. So thank you to everyone.
Thanks very much, everybody. It's been really great.
Thanks for inviting me to be a part of this. Jack, you were a great host.
Yeah, definitely. Well done.
Thanks, everyone. Wonderful. So I guess we just end the call.
Right.
Take
Bye,
care, everyone.
everyone.
Oh, and remember, we do have another Future Flavours of Sound event at 4 p.m. today for non-linear and interactive sound. So do be sure to join that if you're free. Cool. Take care.
Bye, thank you.
Bye, everyone.